When I moved into Willow Creek Estates, I thought I'd found the perfect neighborhood. The lawns were neat, the streets were quiet, and the homes had that warm, lived-in charm that suggested friendly neighbors and summer block parties. I'd saved for years to buy this place, a little two-story with a wraparound porch where I imagined sipping morning coffee in peace. But what I didn't know, what no real estate agent had mentioned, was that my dream home came with a nightmare attached. Her name was Karen. Karen wasn't just a neighbor, she was the self-proclaimed queen of the Homeowners Association, a woman who carried a clipboard like a scepter and enforced every petty rule with a zeal that bordered on obsession. From the moment I moved in, her watchful eyes were everywhere. If my trash cans were out 5 minutes early, I'd find a warning taped to my front door. If my grass was an inch too high, there'd be a sternly worded email in my inbox, and heaven forbid a guest parked slightly askew in my driveway. Karen would materialize out of thin air to scold them on the spot. At first, I tried to laugh it off. Every neighborhood had a Karen, right? But it didn't take long for her to escalate. What started with nitpicking turned into outright harassment. The final straw came one crisp October morning when I backed out of my driveway and felt the sickening crunch beneath my tires. I stepped out to see a strip of metal spikes, deliberately placed where I couldn't miss them. That was the moment I realized Karen had gone too far. What she didn't realize was that her little stunt wasn't just petty, it was criminal. And soon enough, the cuffs would be on her wrists, not mine. Willow Creek Estates looked like it belonged in a glossy real estate brochure. Manicured lawns stretched beneath towering oaks, their leaves fluttering in the breeze. Each house wore a fresh coat of paint in soft pastels or warm earth tones, and the sidewalks seemed swept clean by unseen hands. On paper, it was idyllic. But beneath that charming veneer lurked a quiet tension, one that pulsed beneath every friendly wave and neighborhood barbecue. Much of that tension traced back to one person, Karen. I first met her the day I moved in. The moving truck had barely parked when a slender woman in her late 50s strode up my driveway, clipboard in hand. Her hair was an immovable helmet of frosted blonde, and her expression suggested she had smelled something unpleasant. She introduced herself curtly as the head of the HOA board and proceeded to rattle off a list of rules I was expected to follow. No holiday decorations before November, no flags or banners of any kind, no lawn ornaments, no parking on the street overnight, and on and on. I listened politely, chalking it up to an overzealous neighbor. But within days, I understood the depth of her control. Karen monitored the neighborhood like a hawk, walking the streets in her oversized sunglasses, phone always ready to snap photos of perceived violations. She had a reputation. Longtime residents whispered about her vendettas. One neighbor fined repeatedly for a garden gnome, another threatened with legal action over a bird feeder. Families with young kids kept their heads down. Newcomers like me quickly learned that Karen's goodwill was hard to earn and easily lost. She had allies too, a small group of equally officious board members who rubber-stamped her decisions. Together, they wielded the HOA's power like a weapon, turning neighbor against neighbor. Those who dared challenge Karen often found themselves targeted with sudden inspections or surprise fines. The neighborhood Facebook group had become a minefield of passive-aggressive posts and thinly veiled threats. For a while I tried to stay neutral. I mowed my lawn religiously, kept my trash bins tucked out of sight, and avoided unnecessary interactions. But even that wasn't enough. Karen had an eye for the smallest infractions and a memory that never seemed to forget a perceived slight. One evening, after a friend parked in my driveway with a tire slightly on the grass, I woke the next morning to find a warning letter shoved into my mailbox. It became clear that Karen viewed the HOA as her personal kingdom. Dissent was treason. I watched as neighbors tiptoed around her, resentment simmering beneath forced smiles. The illusion of a friendly community was crumbling. Still, none of us had imagined just how far Karen was willing to go to maintain her grip on power. Not until the day I found that spike strip and realized this was no longer a petty feud. This was war. It all started with a car. More specifically, my younger brother's car. He had flown in for a weekend visit, eager to see the new house and catch up. That Friday evening after dinner, he parked his old silver sedan in my driveway, pulling slightly to one side so we'd still have space to maneuver my car in and out. It seemed harmless enough, After all, it was my driveway. But Karen noticed. Of course she did. The next morning, as we were enjoying coffee on the porch, she marched up in her signature brisk gait, clipboard nowhere in sight this time. This was personal. Her lips were pressed into a thin line. Without a greeting, she launched into a tirade about how guest vehicles were not permitted to remain overnight in driveways without HOA approval. I blinked, confused, certain no such rule existed. I politely explained that my brother was visiting and that he would be gone by Sunday, but Karen wasn't interested in explanations. She pointed at the sedan as though it were a rusted eyesore ruining the neighborhood's image. "We have standards here," she snapped. "You can't just let anyone park wherever they want." Her voice had risen loud enough for nearby neighbors to glance our way. Embarrassed, I kept my tone calm, thanked her for her input and assured her the car would be gone soon. But Karen wasn't satisfied. She left with a parting warning. "I'll be reporting this." That should have been the end of it. But with Karen, things rarely ended simply. The next day, an official-looking letter from the HOA appeared in my mailbox, citing me for an unapproved guest vehicle. The citation came with a fine. I was dumbfounded. Nowhere in the bylaws I'd reviewed when moving in was there any such restriction on driveway parking. I emailed the HOA to dispute the fine, attaching photos of the empty street and my own driveway. The reply I received was chilling in its pettiness. "Your compliance with community standards will be reviewed by the board. Continued violations may result in further action." The signature at the bottom, Karen's of course. I could feel my patience wearing thin. I reached out to a few neighbors, hoping to get a sense of whether this was common. To my surprise, several shared similar stories: tickets for parked delivery trucks, warnings for children's bikes left near garages, even threats over Halloween decorations. Karen was on a mission, and I had just become her latest target. The next few days were tense. I noticed Karen pacing by my house more often, phone in hand, snapping pictures of everything. My brother cut his visit short, uncomfortable with the hostility. As he left, he joked, "You've got your own personal stalker." I laughed, but uneasily. Something had shifted. What had begun as a petty parking dispute was spiraling into something uglier. And though I didn't know it yet, Karen was preparing to take things to a level none of us could have imagined. After the parking incident, something in Karen seemed to snap. It was as if I'd unknowingly triggered some deeper, more vindictive streak in her. Within days, I became hyper-aware of her presence. Her usual walks around the neighborhood became more frequent, and her gaze lingered on my property with an intensity that was hard to ignore. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but the evidence quickly piled up. One afternoon, I came home to find a violation notice taped to my front door, citing an unsightly weed growing between two paving stones in my walkway. It was absurd. The supposed weed was barely visible, a stubborn blade of grass that could have been plucked in seconds. The point wasn't the grass. It was control. The message was clear. I was now on her radar, and I wasn't alone. Conversations with other neighbors revealed a wave of new complaints and citations being issued left and right. One elderly couple down the street, the Garcias, received a warning for having a small wind chime on their porch. Another family was cited for leaving their garbage bins out an hour past pickup time. The stories poured in, each more ridiculous than the last. It became a daily game of cat and mouse. I'd catch Karen taking photos of my yard, leaning over the property line with her phone aimed at my flower beds. Once, I saw her peering into my backyard from the sidewalk, scribbling notes into a small notebook. When I confronted her, she simply smiled and walked away without a word. The community atmosphere shifted noticeably. Neighbors who once greeted each other with warm waves now exchanged wary glances. Conversations were hushed, cautious, as if speaking too freely might invite Karen's wrath. A once friendly block began to feel like a surveillance state under the watchful eye of an unelected enforcer. Frustrated but determined, I started documenting everything. I installed a discreet security camera above my garage and kept a log of Karen's visits and the notices I received. Several neighbors did the same. We began to quietly compare notes, building a record of her escalating behavior. There was talk of petitioning the HOA board for her removal, but Karen's grip on the board was tight. She'd surrounded herself with like-minded allies who echoed her rigid interpretation of the community's bylaws. Behind closed doors, discontent simmered. I heard whispers of neighbors hiring attorneys, others considering moving out entirely. The stress was taking a toll on everyone. But despite the growing resistance, Karen remained emboldened. Each new complaint seemed to fuel her sense of power. Then, late one night, a neighbor messaged me with a chilling update. Karen had been overheard boasting at a board meeting that she would make an example out of me. The words hung in my mind like a threat. I tightened security around my home, wary of what she might try next. I didn't have to wait long. The spike strip would be her answer. A move so reckless and vindictive that it would finally expose her true nature for all to see. The morning it happened began like any other. The air was crisp with the first real bite of autumn, and a soft fog clung to the ground as the sun climbed higher. I grabbed my travel mug, keys in hand, and stepped out to my car, parked as usual in the driveway. The air smelled of wet leaves and cool earth. Everything seemed calm, but as soon as I reversed, an unnatural crunch reverberated through the car, followed by a sickening hiss. My stomach dropped. I braked immediately and jumped out, heart racing. There, laid across the lower third of my driveway, was a gleaming metal strip studded with sharp steel spikes. The device looked professionally made. Not a crude assembly of nails, but a manufactured spike strip designed to puncture tires. And it had done its job well. Both rear tires were sagging, air escaping in steady streams. For a few seconds, I simply stared, struggling to process what I was seeing. Then anger rose through the shock. There was no way this was an accident. The placement was too precise, too deliberate. Someone had wanted to damage my car, and I had a sickeningly clear idea of who that someone was. I glanced up and down the street. No one was outside yet, the morning still quiet. I pulled out my phone and took photos from every angle. After removing the strip and inspecting the damage, I walked back inside, pulse pounding. I reviewed the footage from my security camera, scrubbing through the early morning hours. And there she was, at 5:47 a.m., a figure in a hooded jacket, slight and familiar, stepping carefully up my driveway. In her gloved hands, the unmistakable outline of the spike strip. She placed it with meticulous care, adjusted its position, then retreated into the dawn. Even beneath the hood, there was no mistaking her posture, her gait. It was Karen. I called the police immediately. The dispatcher took my statement and promised to send an officer. Within an hour, a patrol car pulled up. I showed the officer the damage, the spike strip, and most damning of all, the security footage. His brow furrowed as he watched Karen's figure creeping across my driveway. It wasn't hard to see the intent. "This is serious," he said. "We'll need to collect this as evidence, and I'd recommend filing for a restraining order if this continues." As the officer documented the scene, neighbors began to trickle outside, drawn by the flashing lights and the unmistakable air of drama. I could see the curiosity in their faces, the whispered questions. Word spread quickly. Karen had finally crossed a line no one could ignore. And then, as if on cue, Karen appeared at the edge of her lawn, arms crossed, eyes locked on me with cold defiance. When the officer approached her to ask questions, she launched into a tirade of denial, insisting she'd been framed, that I was trying to discredit her because of ongoing community disputes. The officer remained impassive, calmly noting her statements and informing her that the matter would be fully investigated. Karen's composure cracked for just a moment when I mentioned the security footage. Her face flushed, her voice faltered, but she quickly regained her haughty stance. "I will speak to my lawyer," she said, turning on her heel and storming back inside. I watched her retreat with a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction. For the first time, she wasn't in control. The evidence was undeniable, the damage done. What she hadn't anticipated was that her latest act of harassment wasn't just petty, it was criminal, and the wheels of justice were now in motion. After the officer left with the spike strip and a copy of my security footage, I sat in my living room, adrenaline still coursing through me. My hands shook slightly as I sipped lukewarm coffee. The weight of what had just happened settled in. This wasn't a simple HOA squabble anymore. Karen had committed an act of vandalism that could have easily caused injury. What if I'd been driving with a child in the car? What if a neighbor had stepped on that strip? The thought made my stomach turn. Determined not to let this slide, I called the non-emergency number for the county sheriff's department. I wanted to make sure this incident was properly escalated. The dispatcher listened attentively as I explained everything again and assured me a detective would be assigned to follow up. I provided the report number from the officer who had come earlier and offered to email over the video footage. Over the next 2 days, I heard little. I busied myself documenting the entire timeline of events, from the parking dispute to the mounting citations and now the spike strip. I printed out copies of emails, violation letters, and screenshots of messages exchanged with neighbors. More than once, I caught Karen watching my house from her front window, her glare icy and unflinching. She still believed she was untouchable. But the tide was shifting. Several neighbors approached me quietly, offering support. Word had spread quickly about the spike strip. One neighbor, Mark, shared that his car had nearly suffered the same fate. He'd spotted a similar strip near his curb a week prior, but assumed it was random debris. Now he suspected otherwise. Another neighbor, Maria, confessed she had recordings of Karen pacing her driveway late at night. The pattern of harassment was no longer just my word against Karen's. 3 days after the incident, Detective Ramirez from the sheriff's department called. He spoke in a calm, professional tone but made it clear they were taking this seriously. I invited him over and showed him everything: footage, photos, documents, and neighbor statements. He nodded as he reviewed the evidence, occasionally jotting notes. "This is more than a simple HOA dispute," he said, eyes narrowing as he rewound the video to the moment Karen set the strip down. "This is criminal mischief at the very least, possibly reckless endangerment." The validation brought a strange mix of relief and renewed anger. It was comforting to know the law was on my side, but infuriating that it had come to this. Detective Ramirez explained the next steps. He would present the evidence to the district attorney, and if charges were approved, they would move forward with an arrest warrant. He cautioned me to remain vigilant, but assured me that Karen was already on their radar. Meanwhile, Karen seemed oblivious to the growing storm. The day after Ramirez's visit, I overheard her on the sidewalk, loudly proclaiming that some people just can't handle the rules and that false accusations won't hold up in court. Her arrogance was staggering. Perhaps she still believed her influence over the HOA board would shield her. But the truth was out now, and the authorities weren't swayed by HOA politics. As I watched the detective's car pull away, a quiet determination settled over me. I had done everything right. I had the evidence. And soon, Karen would discover that not even her iron grip on the neighborhood could protect her from the consequences of her own actions. The following week unfolded like the slow tightening of a noose. Each day brought fresh confirmation that Karen's grip on the neighborhood was slipping. Detective Ramirez continued gathering evidence, making his presence known in Willow Creek Estates. His unmarked car appeared several times on our street, and neighbors watched from behind curtains as he visited house after house. One by one, residents came forward with their own stories and proof. It wasn't just about the spike strip anymore. Karen's reign of terror had left a long trail of intimidation and petty harassment. I spoke again with Maria, who had since reviewed weeks of her own security footage. Together, we found 2 separate instances where Karen had been on her property late at night, inspecting her garden and driveway without permission. Another neighbor, James, turned over emails from Karen that threatened fines for supposed violations that weren't supported by the HOA's own rules. Ramirez now had a growing stack of complaints, and it was clear this was no isolated incident. At the same time, the HOA board's unity began to fracture. Whispers of dissent spread through the neighborhood. I heard from one board member who asked to remain anonymous that several members were distancing themselves from Karen in private. Fear of legal repercussions had begun to outweigh loyalty. No one wanted to be caught defending actions that now had the sheriff's department involved. Publicly, Karen remained defiant. She doubled down on her usual routines, strutting the sidewalks with a false air of confidence. But there was a brittleness to her now, a certain hesitation in her movements. When Ramirez stopped by her house one afternoon for a formal interview, half the neighborhood seemed to be watching. Karen's loud protests could be heard from across the street, though the detective remained calm and professional. Afterward, she slammed her door with enough force to rattle the windows. The psychological tide was turning. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down began speaking openly. A small group of residents organized a petition to formally remove Karen from the HOA board, gathering signatures with surprising speed. Conversations that had once been whispered in driveways now happened in broad daylight. There was a sense of solidarity growing, a shared determination to reclaim the neighborhood from her oppressive influence. Throughout it all, I kept careful notes and maintained regular contact with Detective Ramirez. He informed me that the district attorney had reviewed the case and was preparing to issue an arrest warrant. The spike strip alone was sufficient grounds for criminal charges, and with the added testimony from neighbors, the case against Karen had grown ironclad. Still, caution was necessary. Ramirez advised me to avoid provoking Karen further and to continue documenting everything. I followed his advice, even as Karen's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She paced her yard in the evenings, glaring across the street at my house. One night, she left a rambling post on the neighborhood Facebook group, accusing unnamed residents of conspiring against her. The message was deleted by morning, but screenshots circulated quickly. By the end of the week, the atmosphere in Willow Creek Estates had shifted palpably. Karen's aura of invincibility had cracked. The woman who had once ruled the HOA with fear and intimidation now looked like a cornered animal. The community had found its voice, and the law was closing in. All that remained was the final act, one that would play out far more publicly than Karen could have ever anticipated. The morning it happened dawned crisp and clear. I was sipping coffee on my porch, a ritual I had grown to cherish as a small act of defiance. Across the street, Karen's curtains were drawn, her house eerily quiet. The neighborhood buzzed with an undercurrent of anticipation. Word had spread that an arrest warrant had been approved. No one knew exactly when it would happen, but everyone sensed that the day had arrived. Around 10 o'clock, a black and white sheriff's cruiser rolled slowly into the neighborhood, followed closely by an unmarked car. They parked deliberately in front of Karen's house. Doors opened, and Detective Ramirez stepped out, flanked by two uniformed deputies. Neighbors emerged from their homes, pretending to check mail or walk dogs, though all eyes were trained on the unfolding scene. I stood at the edge of my porch, heart pounding. It was one thing to know this moment was coming, another to witness it in real time. The deputies approached Karen's front door and knocked firmly. For a few long seconds, there was no response. Then the door cracked open, and Karen appeared, her expression a mask of indignation and disbelief. From my vantage point, I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could read the body language. Ramirez spoke calmly, showing her a document, likely the warrant. Karen's face flushed bright red. She shook her head violently, gesturing with clipped motions, her mouth working furiously. Ramirez remained steady, explaining the situation. One of the deputies shifted subtly, prepared for resistance. Suddenly, Karen's voice rang out loud and clear, echoing down the street. "This is harassment! I am the head of this community! You can't do this to me!" Her shrill protests only seemed to galvanize the deputies. Ramirez stepped aside, giving the deputies room to move in. Without further warning, one deputy gently but firmly guided Karen out onto her front porch. The other read her rights in a calm, measured tone. Karen thrashed against their grip, shouting about conspiracies, legal action, and how she would ruin everyone responsible. The deputies remained professional, not rising to her bait. They turned her around and secured her wrists with handcuffs. The sight was surreal. The woman who had terrorized this neighborhood for years, whose smug glances and petty rules had dominated daily life, now stood powerless and cuffed beneath the clear blue sky. Cameras clicked from multiple porches. Phones recorded video that would soon circulate through every inbox and group chat in Willow Creek Estates. Karen's tirade continued, even as she was led to the cruiser. Her voice cracked under the strain, the words growing less coherent with each step. Finally, the door closed behind her with a decisive thunk, muting her protests. Ramirez exchanged a few final words with the remaining deputy, then approached several of us who had gathered nearby. "It's done," he said simply. "She'll be processed, and the charges will proceed from here. I suggest you all continue documenting any further incidents, but for now, she's in our custody." There was a palpable release of tension in the air, as if an invisible weight had been lifted. Neighbors who had barely spoken in months now exchanged relieved glances and quiet congratulations. The fear was gone. Karen was no longer above the law. As the cruisers pulled away, I exhaled a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Justice had finally caught up with her, and for the first time in a long while, Willow Creek Estates felt like a community again. In the days following Karen's arrest, the neighborhood seemed to breathe easier. Conversations returned to front lawns and sidewalks, no longer whispered behind closed doors. Children played more freely outside, and neighbors greeted each other with genuine smiles. The oppressive atmosphere that had blanketed Willow Creek Estates had finally lifted. Karen, of course, faced multiple charges: property damage, reckless endangerment, and harassment. Though she posted bail quickly, her influence over the HOA evaporated almost overnight. A special board meeting was called, and with overwhelming support, she was formally removed from her position. Even her closest allies distanced themselves, eager to salvage what remained of their reputations. In the weeks that followed, a wave of positive change swept through the community. The petition to reform the HOA's enforcement policies passed with near unanimous support. Clear guidelines were established to prevent future abuse of power, and transparency became the new standard. A new board made up of level-headed and fair-minded neighbors began the slow process of rebuilding trust. For my part, I repaired my car and took down the extra security cameras, though one remains above the garage, a small reminder that vigilance matters. Several neighbors stopped by to thank me for standing up, their gratitude sincere. We began to gather again for block parties and holiday events, the camaraderie returning stronger than before. Karen's house still stands, though it remains quiet now, the curtains perpetually drawn. I hear whispers that she may be planning to move. Perhaps she's realized that her era of unchecked power is over. Either way, the neighborhood has reclaimed its peace, and as I sit on my porch each morning, coffee in hand, I smile knowing that sometimes, when you stand up to bullies, justice really does prevail. Looking back, it's still hard to believe how a simple parking dispute spiraled into something so intense. When I first moved to Willow Creek Estates, I thought I was gaining a peaceful home and a friendly neighborhood. I never imagined I'd end up in the middle of a legal battle with a self-appointed enforcer of petty rules. But life has a way of teaching you lessons when you least expect them. One of the biggest lessons I learned is the importance of standing your ground. Bullies thrive on fear and silence. For months, many of us in the neighborhood had tolerated Karen's behavior, hoping it would pass or that she would lose interest. But enabling harassment only emboldens those who seek to control others. The moment I decided to document her actions and involve the authorities was the moment the tide began to turn. Sometimes the hardest step is the first one, but it's also the most critical. I also learned the value of community. When neighbors come together and support one another, even the strongest grip of intimidation can be broken. Watching so many people, some of whom I barely knew, offer statements, evidence, and encouragement reminded me that solidarity is a powerful force. Alone, it's easy to feel helpless against someone like Karen. Together, we reclaimed our voice and our neighborhood. Another takeaway is the importance of documentation. Had I not installed that security camera, Karen's actions could have easily been dismissed as hearsay. In situations like this, evidence is your strongest ally. It provides clarity when emotions run high and leaves little room for denial. Finally, I've come to appreciate the role of law enforcement when used properly. Detective Ramirez and his team treated the situation with the seriousness it deserved. Their professionalism restored my faith that justice can prevail when the system works as it should. Today, Willow Creek Estates feels lighter, freer, more connected. The scars Karen left will fade with time, replaced by a renewed sense of community. As for me, I sit on my porch each morning with a deeper appreciation for peace hard-earned. And whenever a new neighbor moves in, I'm quick to offer one piece of advice: always stand up for what's right, because sometimes doing so can change everything.